Imagine a C-suite executive looking you in the eye and guaranteeing a $5 billion revenue stream for a key pipeline asset in April.
Right.
Now imagine sitting on their July earnings call, waiting for an update, and that $5 billion is completely gone. Management does not revise the number.
They do not even acknowledge the miss.
Exactly. They simply cease to acknowledge the asset exists. Our objective for this deep dive is a rigid institutional audit of AstraZeneca's Q2 2026 earnings call.
We are taking the statements made in July and mapping them strictly against the baseline parameters management established in their Q1 call this past April.
For you, the listener updating discounted cash flow models or assessing C-suite credibility, the focus is not on the headline earnings beat. The focus is on the gap.
We are hunting the divergence between what management promised last quarter and what they actually delivered this quarter.
And we begin that audit by tracking the linguistic and structural pivots in the corporate narrative.
The most critical pivot occurred immediately in the forward-looking guidance. Back in April, management explicitly modeled what they called growing confidence in their 2030 revenue ambitions.
Right. Growing confidence.
But by July, following a high-profile Phase III trial failure, that exact phrase was surgically altered. Management stated their confidence is now intact.
I mean, that is a fundamental semantic shift. If you are modeling a terminal growth rate, growing implies momentum, it implies compounding clinical wins, and an upward trajectory.
Precisely. Intact is a defensive posture.
It signals a company holding the line. They are absorbing a structural shock and redistributing narrative weight just to maintain the floor. It tells the analyst that the core growth thesis has taken a hit.
And that management is currently engaged in narrative damage control. It indicates a reallocation of rhetorical capital to offset a real-world deficit.
It is not a total pipeline collapse, but a structural pivot.
Right. When a multi-billion-dollar catalyst fails to materialize, the surrounding portfolio architecture must flex to carry the dead weight.
So to understand how management is executing that redistribution, we first need to isolate the assets that actually delivered data this quarter.
And measure how aggressively the C-suite is now pumping their valuations to cover the gaps emerging elsewhere.
Which brings us to the deliveries. This is where we see management's rhetoric heavily front-running the actual clinical data.
Let us start with Elecoglipron, their GLP-1 asset.
In April, Sharon Barr was notably restrained on this front. When pressed by Guggenheim's Seamus Fernandez, she refused to preview the data.
She stated only that the Phase I results gave them the confidence to proceed to a comprehensive Phase III program.
Which is a measured, institutionally appropriate response ahead of the American Diabetes Association conference.
Yes, but the narrative temperature in July was drastically elevated. The ADA data dropped, showing up to 11.8% weight loss at week 36 in the obesity population.
Seemingly without a plateau.
Right. The moment that metric became public, management deployed the phrase multi-blockbuster asset.
Immediately.
They immediately announced Phase III enrollment for the MBOL obesity program, the 5-trial Illuminate program for type 2 diabetes, and critically, a third program called Elevate.
Elevate is the strategic tell here. That trial targets heart failure with preserved ejection fraction and chronic kidney disease.
Specifically on the background of dapagliflozin.
Right, their existing blockbuster drug Farxiga, they are directly wiring this new GLP-1 asset into their entrenched cardiovascular and renal infrastructure.
It is a blatant hedge against the ongoing loss of exclusivity and patent cliffs approaching for Farxiga.
It is a calculated commercial maneuver to maintain market dominance in the cardiovascular space.
But look at the terminology shift. Moving from gave us confidence to proceed in April to a guaranteed multi-blockbuster asset in July requires intense skepticism.
12 weeks of internal preparation produced a massive Phase III suite that management is now aggressively naming in commercial terms.
Despite the fact that Phase III trials are where metabolic drugs routinely fail due to rare safety signals or tolerability dropouts at scale.
If I am an analyst listening to this, I am pushing back hard on that GLP-1 rhetoric. They are running entirely ahead of the evidence.
Treating an 11.8% weight loss metric from a modest Phase I study as a guaranteed multi-blockbuster across 3 separate Phase III trials, it is fundamentally flawed modeling.
It is the equivalent of a portfolio manager pricing in a successful corporate mega-merger before the regulatory ink is even dry on the proposal.
The clinical momentum is present, sure, but the sudden hyper-commercialization of the language is a deliberate distraction technique.
They need the street focused on the massive GLP-1 upside to mask the deterioration in other verticals.
It directs institutional attention toward the largest possible total addressable market, or TAM, just to hide the rot underneath.
We see a similar dynamic with Clarity Gastrico 1, though perhaps with slightly more clinical justification.
This is sonesitatug vedotin, their wholly owned antibody-drug conjugate, or ADC, targeting CLDN 18.2 in gastric cancer.
Right. In April, Susan Galbraith projected a readout in the second half of the year, but the data delivered in the very first month of that window.
And it hit the overall survival dual primary endpoint.
Overall survival is the gold standard in oncology. It proves the drug actually extends the patient's life, not just delays tumor growth.
But more importantly for the revenue model, look at the CLDN 18.2 positivity cutoff utilized in the trial. It was greater than 25% at any staining intensity.
That is notably lower than competing therapies, which require a much higher density of the protein on the tumor to be effective.
Lowering that biomarker barrier expands the eligible patient population to an estimated 180,000 patients across the U.S., Europe, China, and Japan.
And based on that expanded TAM, Pascal Soriot immediately assigned a peak sales estimate of $3 billion to $5 billion.
While Galbraith mapped out extension vectors into first-line gastric, pancreatic, and biliary tract cancers.
Delivering the data early allowed management to lock in a multi-billion-dollar narrative anchor right at the top of the research and development section.
It set a tone of overwhelming success before they had to address any failures.
We see that exact same anchor strategy applied to Tozorakimab, the COPD biologic.
In April, this asset was framed as having potential to be first and best in class, with a revenue guidance range of $3 billion to $5 billion.
By July, Soriot moved the goalposts. He established a hard floor, stating they increased their peak revenue expectation to more than $5 billion.
The absolute ceiling of the April range became the baseline floor of the July range.
And the tactical shift during the analyst Q&A was equally telling. When BNP's Peter Verdult asked about the competitive landscape in COPD, Ruud Dobber utilized the drug's mechanism of action as a defensive moat.
Specifically, its dual effect on both the anti-inflammatory pathway and the mucus pathway.
Right. In April, that dual pathway science was used to generate forward-looking excitement.
In July, the exact same science was deployed as armor to fend off questions about Sanofi and Regeneron's competing drug, Dupixent.
The issue here is narrative inertia. The $5 billion plus figure now sits above the prior stated range, yet zero commercial revenue has been recorded.
The data underpinning this aggressive forecast are Phase III trial results that still await full presentation at the European Respiratory Society Congress in September.
Management is leaning on incomplete clinical metrics to dictate a commercial floor.
If the rhetoric around GLP-1 and Tozorakimab is front-running the data, we must examine the assets where management is quietly pumping the brakes.
The transition from aggressive acceleration to quiet reprioritization is where the credibility gap widens most significantly.
When a C-suite extends product timelines they committed to just 3 months prior, your DCF models must be fundamentally restructured to account for the delayed cash flows.
Let us analyze the launch of Baxfendy. In April, the narrative surrounding Baxdrostat's PDUFA beat the FDA's hard deadline to approve or reject the drug was defined by overwhelming momentum.
Dobber defended an unhedged $5 billion to $10 billion peak sales target, pointing to heavy SG&A investments.
Those are the selling, general, and administrative expenses required to hire a massive sales force and build out commercial infrastructure.
He used that capital expenditure as proof of launch confidence.
Fast forward to July. The drug is FDA approved, the launch is technically underway, but management introduces a massive structural qualifier that was completely absent from the April transcript.
They stated commercial access will only broaden in anticipation of Medicare Part D reimbursements beginning in 2028.
2028 represents roughly 2 full years of constrained commercial access for an asset that launched this spring.
To understand the mechanics here, Medicare Part D redesign means insurers are facing higher liabilities and are pushing back aggressively on formulary placement for new drugs.
Standard affordability programs and market access negotiations are expected hurdles, but explicitly acknowledging a multi-year commercial dead zone before Medicare reimbursement kicks in was absolutely not part of the April calculus.
Notice how management handled the defensive tactics during the Q&A when pressed on this.
Right. Christopher Cade from SE directly asked about primary aldosteronism screening acting as a bottleneck on the launch velocity. Patients have to be screened before they can be prescribed the drug.
Sharon Barr offered a highly confident clinical response about trial recruitment. She emphasized the necessity of having an approved therapy on the market before physicians will standardize their screening protocols.
It was a flawless deflection. She solved the clinical math to entirely hide the commercial drag.
The Part D timeline is a 2-year commercial bridge to nowhere, and they successfully directed the analyst's attention away from the reimbursement reality and toward a solvable clinical screening issue.
We see this exact posture of deferral applied to camistrant, their oral SERD, being tested in the SERENA-4 trial for breast cancer.
In April, management provided a highly structured analytical case for why their trial would succeed, where Roche's competing drug in the Persevera trial failed.
Galbraith pointed to their larger enrollment size, sizing the trial to detect a smaller statistical effect and specifically enriching the cohort for an endocrine-sensitive population.
It was a robust, proactive mathematical defense.
Then the Persevere data from Roche was actually presented at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting.
And when Richard Vosser at JPM asked what those failed outcomes imply for SERENA-4 during the July call, the proactive defense vanished.
Galbraith completely dodged the comparison. She stated simply, "Obviously, we have to wait for that readout."
Furthermore, when pressed on the exact timing of the upcoming European Society for Medical Oncology Congress presentation, Dave Fredrickson stated they could not comment any more specifically.
April's structured analytical confidence devolved entirely into July's posture of waiting.
This refusal to comment on timing or reiterate the scientific rationale signals acute narrative inertia.
When a management team spends an entire quarter explaining exactly why their trial design will win, and then suddenly tells you they have to wait and see after a competitor fails, you must adjust your probability of technical success downward.
Delaying a timeline or waiting for a medical conference is a standard pharmaceutical maneuver. Institutional models price that in.
But completely memory-holing a high-priority asset is a major red flag for corporate governance and financial modeling. Which brings us to the most critical component of the audit, the evaporated narratives.
When a C-suite quietly drops a strategic initiative they heavily promoted just 1 quarter prior, they are executing a containment protocol.
They are attempting to minimize the blast radius of a clinical failure so it does not infect the broader portfolio evaluation.
The most glaring example in the July transcript is Wainua ATTR-CM, their treatment for transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy.
The CardioTransform trial failed. It did not provide a statistically significant benefit on the composite endpoint of cardiovascular mortality and recurrent cardiovascular events.
In April, Ruud Dauber explicitly modeled $5 billion plus peak sales for this exact indication.
He volunteered that figure entirely unprompted during a response to an analyst.
In July, that $5 billion figure vanished without a trace.
Instead of issuing a financial revision or a post-mortem on the market impact, Sharon Barr replaced the commercial projection with what we can only classify as consolation science.
She stated, "These results contribute meaningfully to the greater scientific understanding."
There was zero reflection on the absolute financial confidence projected in April.
The transition from a hard $5 billion commercial target to basic scientific contribution was executed with zero narrative bridging.
If you are an analyst who built your discounted cash flow model around April's $5 billion Wainua projection, management gave you absolutely zero updated commercial signaling in July.
It is a financial ghost town.
You cannot simply delete a $5 billion line item from a spreadsheet without altering the terminal value of the entire cardiovascular franchise, but management offered no guidance on how to bridge that gap.
And worse, the blast radius extended beyond the failed indication to healthy assets.
Right. In April, management provided a robust, independent commercial update on Wainua ATTR-PN, the surviving polyneuropathy franchise that is already approved and generating revenue.
Dauber claimed they were leading the pack in pure PN patients in the U.S. He specifically cited their home administration profile as a competitive moat against Alnilam and described launch uptake as very strong.
Yet in July, there was zero mention of the PN indication. Nothing in the prepared remarks, nothing in the Q&A.
Why did a surviving, commercially active, revenue-generating franchise have to completely disappear from the earnings call just because a trial in a related indication failed?
Because of institutional containment.
Management does not want to utter the keyword Wainua on the call, even in relation to the successful indication.
Because doing so inevitably invites margin, revenue, and capital reallocation questions regarding the cardiomyopathy failure they are actively trying to bury.
They willfully sacrifice the update on a performing asset strictly way to maintain radio silence on a failed one.
We see the exact same evaporation protocol applied to Emerald-3. In April, Susan Galbraith used this trial, which combines Imfinzi and Imjudo, with a TACE procedure in hepatocellular carcinoma, or liver cancer, as her leading R&D headline.
She touted a 200,000 patient eligible population and described it as the vanguard of a series of high-value oncology readouts.
3 months later, Emerald-3 was entirely absent. There was no ASCO recap, no regulatory filing update, and no mention during the Q&A.
When a $5 billion narrative or a lead oncology headline evaporates, a vacuum is created on the balance sheet.
Management cannot leave a multi-billion-dollar vacuum on an earnings call without triggering a sell-off.
They must engineer a structural defense to absorb the shock and redirect the institutional models.
This requires us to examine their defensive tactics, specifically the deployment of what we classify as the probability machine.
This was the most calculated rhetorical maneuver of the entire quarter. In April, Pascal Soriot heavily promoted the 2026 pipeline readout cohort,
guaranteeing it carried a risk-adjusted peak year revenue potential exceeding $10 billion. It was framed as guaranteed upward momentum.
In July, following the Wainua failure, Louisa Hector at Berenberg directly challenged the C-suite. She asked whether that $10 billion cohort guidance still stood given the collapse of a central pillar.
The response from CFO Aradhanasuran and Soriat was purely mechanical. They deployed a probability of technical success, or PTS, framework to defend the number.
To understand the mechanics of PTS, if a drug has a $10 billion total addressable market, but historically only has a 50% chance of passing Phase III trials, a quantitative analyst models its expected value at $5 billion.
Soriat argued that the failed Wainua asset was modeled with standard industry risk, meaning they assumed a high chance of failure, while the successfully upgraded Tozorakimab asset was modeled with low risk.
Therefore, mathematically, the upside of the latter cancels out the complete failure of the former.
We must ruthlessly audit this retroactive convenience pivot.
It is the equivalent of a casino dealer shuffling the deck after a bad hand to distract from the chips they just took off the table.
You cannot loudly trumpet a guaranteed $10 billion pipeline trajectory in April, and then, when a core multi-billion-dollar pillar collapses in June, point to a spreadsheet in July and claim, we budgeted for this failure all along.
They are attempting to convert an actual real-world clinical and commercial loss into a mere accounting category.
The math regarding the risk adjustment is technically coherent. They did disclose the PTS framework at a prior investor day.
But the rhetorical deployment here is purely defensive. It is a textbook example of using pre-existing probabilistic architecture to sanitize a real-world deficit.
Soriat also added a profitability calculus to the defense. He noted that Tozorakimab is 100% owned by AstraZeneca, whereas Wainua would have required massive profit-sharing payouts to their partner, Ionis.
We can contrast this highly defensive posture with the few areas where management offered genuine, direct transparency.
When James Gordon at Barclays asked about the Saruparib program, their selective PARP inhibitor in prostate cancer, Susan Galbraith did not deflect to a probability matrix.
She directly confirmed the $5 billion-plus peak sales assessment for the totality of the program without hedging the methodology.
That directness in oncology only highlights the evasion used in the cardiovascular space.
The final piece of the audit involves a significant structural shift in how management is framing the macroeconomic environment, specifically regarding China.
In April, China was treated as a standard, manageable financial headwind. Management discussed the impact of China's volume-based procurement program, or VBP, which forces aggressive price cuts on older drugs.
They framed VBP impacts on Farxiga and Lynparza as a temporary margin issue they could offset by getting newer drugs added to the National Reimbursement Drug List, or NRDL.
In July, following a direct question from Steve Scala, the tone shifted entirely from financial management to competitive reckoning.
Pascal Soriot acknowledged that local Chinese biotechnology companies are no longer just domestic challengers. They are now operating as global threats.
He stated, "We learned to compete with them," and credited this external pressure for forcing AstraZeneca to accelerate their own internal development timelines.
Moving from treating a sovereign market as a balance sheet headwind to acknowledging it as a generator of apex competitors requires a fundamental reassessment of long-term global market share assumptions.
Let us consolidate the audit. AstraZeneca did not suffer a systemic collapse this quarter, but their institutional credibility gap measurably widened.
Management utilized the early data delivery of assets like Gastric01 and the highly publicized yet premature GLP-1 Phase I results to desperately plug narrative holes.
Holes left by Wainua's Phase III failure and Baxfendy's newly revealed Medicare Part D commercial delays.
They executed a masterclass in capital reallocation, not just on the balance sheet, but in their rhetoric.
They aggressively upgraded unproven assets to $5 billion plus status to replace the $5 billion plus assets that objectively failed.
Utilizing a probability matrix to justify the swap to quantitative analysts.
For you, the listener updating your models this quarter, this reinforces why this specific auditing framework is absolutely essential.
Your discounted cash flow models, your revenue projections, and your terminal value calculations are only as accurate as management's credibility.
You can never simply accept what a C-suite guarantees today. You must ruthlessly, mathematically audit it against the exact parameters and promises they established yesterday.
Which leaves us with a final, rigid calculation to factor into your models. If a heavily promoted $5 billion conviction can be downgraded to mere scientific understanding in exactly 12 weeks, with zero financial postmortem provided by the C-suite, how much of a risk premium should you be assigning to July's brand new $5 billion claims for Tozorakimab and Saruparib?
Keep your models updated, your baseline assumptions rigid, and your skepticism high. This concludes the audit.